All right, folks, back in the FITSNews studio for our weekend review. Murdaughs are back once again, top of the charts. It's like a best-selling album that just keeps rolling. We've got huge developments in that case on the federal side. Criminal charges against Alex Murdaugh in federal court. We're going to walk you through those charges and the ramifications of them, and a pissing contest between state and federal prosecutors. We're going to dive into that. We've also got an update on another judicial scandal in South Carolina involving probate court. Our research director, Jen Wood, has been digging deep on some serious alleged malfeasance that could go much bigger than the stories that we've unearthed so far on FITSNews.com. I'm going to dive into that with Jen Wood. After that, an update on South Carolina's abortion debate. A ton of stuff happening there, folks. Court challenges, temporary restraining orders. We've got all sorts of stuff to address on that issue, and we're going to dive into the specific details of that debate that the mainstream media is just glossing over and not really talking about. We're going to give you the very nuts and bolts of whether or not that law will be struck down or upheld. All that and more is heading your way on the Weekend Review. But folks, we are back to the Murdaugh murders, crime, and corruption saga. I promise. We're trying to cover other stuff here. Trying to cover other true crime stuff. We got a 2024 presidential election coming. We got a ton of stuff happening at the South Carolina State House, but the Murdaugh story just keeps churning, keeps going, keeps generating huge headlines. The big news this week, the federal government jumping into this case in a big way. A 22-count, 28-page indictment of Alex Murdaugh issued this Wednesday. Now, there are a host of fiscal allegations contained in this indictment, and I want to walk you through them real quick. We've got crimes against the estate of Donna Badger. We've got crimes against Hakeem Pinckney, against Natasha Thomas, against the Plyler sisters. We've got the Satterfield estate. Tons of victims here referenced in these federal charges. But the charges were eerily similar to those already filed, 102 of them in fact, by the state of South Carolina. And that has led to a pretty significant prosecutorial pissing contest. And I want you to say that 5 times real fast. Prosecutorial pissing contest, prosecutorial pissing contest. I'm only going to do it twice because I don't think I could do it 5 times. But some serious bad blood between prosecutors in the office of South Carolina Attorney General Alan Wilson and the office of new U.S. Attorney Adair Ford Burroughs. Now, Adair Ford Burroughs, appointed to her post by U.S. President Joe Biden, she replaces an interim, Corey Ellis, who followed another interim, who followed 2 previous Trump appointees who lasted roughly a year, one of them now a federal judge. But there's been not a lot of continuity in that U.S. Attorney's office. There's been obviously tons of continuity. Alan Wilson's been the Attorney General of South Carolina. He's on his 4th term, people, so he's been there a while, but not a lot of continuity on that federal side. So a little bit of an unfair fight maybe. The state's certainly well ahead of the feds as it relates to the charges against Alex Murdaugh. But this created a huge, huge discussion this week because there was a big Twitter thread by an attorney, Sarah Azari. We've talked about Sarah before on this show. Sarah's got great legal insight, people. Now, she is close to Murdaugh's attorneys, Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin. But again, not discounting her insight. She's got great insight. But Azari posted a lengthy Twitter thread this week that delved into this. And according to her, the Attorney General's office reneged on an agreement with the feds. According to her, at the very beginning of this process, back when the Murdaugh investigations were first ramping up, she claimed that there was an agreement between federal prosecutors and state prosecutors that the state would focus on the murder charges, the drug charges, the roadside shooting involving Alex Murdaugh and the notorious cousin Eddie Smith, and the feds would handle the financial crimes. Now, obviously, the feds have done a great job on the Murdaugh-related financial crimes that they have prosecuted. In fact, if you followed our Special Projects Director Dylan Nolan's coverage of the Russell Lafitte trial down in Charleston, you know the feds just did a bang-up job prosecuting Russell Lafitte, got guilty verdicts on multiple counts in that case. But now, things are getting interesting as it relates to the Murdaugh case because the allegation that the Attorney General's office reneged on a deal that was hotly disputed by sources close to Wilson, all of whom said that there was never any such agreement in place. And in fact, there was a statement issued by the AG. I wanted to read this because this was the statement that was issued by the Attorney General's office in response to the federal charges. Let me read this real quick. The financial allegations in this case involved alleged abuse of state lawyer licenses, dealing with state court legal actions before state court judges with alleged misappropriation of state court-approved settlements. How many times are they going to throw the word state in there, people? I think they're trying to say something with this statement. But anyway, Wilson said that the federal charges will have no effect on his office's goals to hold Murdaugh accountable and get justice for the victims in this case. But a very interesting statement from the state, some serious pushback against the feds. And in fact, I'm told that there was a heated conversation between Wilson and his lieutenants and Burroughs and her lieutenants in the aftermath of these charges being filed. Basically, the AG's office accusing the feds of copying their work, which, again, things getting very interesting in this case. But Murdaugh will appear before a federal magistrate this coming Wednesday in Charleston for a bond hearing, unless he waives it. But that'll happen on Wednesday. And meanwhile, just yesterday, Friday, in Richland County Court, it was decided that there will be a status conference on the state charges on September 11 of this year, the state financial charges against Alec Murdaugh. Now, how could this come into play? Why is this important? I mean, Alec Murdaugh's already been sentenced to 2 life sentences for murdering his wife and his younger son. He is incarcerated in an undisclosed location. We believe that to be McCormick Correctional Institution. That's what everyone's saying. We're not 100% sure on that, but that's where Murdaugh is alleged to be housed, a maximum security facility. But this situation doesn't seem all that important considering he's behind bars already for the rest of his life. What's the deal here? Well, I'll tell you why it matters. And on this point, Sarah Azari did have some good points. Because let's assume for a moment that Alec Murdaugh's murder convictions are vacated on appeal. Do I think that's going to happen? No. No, I do not. I think Judge Clifton Newman, who presided over that trial, did an incredible job with his rulings on admissibility, with his rulings on the various objections that came up during that trial. Newman took great care. Great care. In fact, if you recall that trial, there were trials within the trial over whether or not these things would be admitted or not, the financial crimes, various other evidence and testimony. Judge Newman did an amazing job. So I don't think Alec Murdaugh's appeal has a snowball's chance in hell. But if it does, that's where this gets interesting. Because the stage is set now with these federal charges for Murdaugh's attorneys, Jim Griffin and Dick Harpootlian, to rush for a plea deal with the federal government to get a quick plea deal approved so that if those murder convictions are vacated, guess what? The feds are at the front of the line all of a sudden. In other words, a federal plea would mean that Murdaugh could potentially be transferred to the custody of the U.S. Bureau of Prisons as opposed to the State Department of Corrections, assuming he is ultimately convicted on those state financial charges. Because, folks, that trial's not going to happen at the very earliest until this fall. And in fact, from what Dylan Nolan was saying at that court hearing on Friday, it may not happen until next year. The state trial and the fiscal charges. So if that doesn't happen until next year and there's already a federal plea in place, guess what? The feds are at the front of the line. But again, none of that will matter until and unless those murder convictions are vacated. So let's talk about where Alec Murdaugh is right now and what's happening. We mentioned McCormick earlier, but there were some rumors that started this past week about Murdaugh potentially requesting a transfer. And they started on the TikTok account of an individual who goes by the name of Jumpsuit Pablo, a former South Carolina Department of Corrections inmate, who now hosts a very popular TikTok page, over 400,000 followers, people. Jumpsuit Pablo, he's huge. He's huge. Posted a video, a reel, I guess they call. What do they call them on TikTok, Dylan? I have no idea. I'm not on the TikTok. And in fact, Dylan's even told me that my joking about not being on the TikTok has gotten a little old. But Jumpsuit Pablo posted a video or a reel of an inmate who claims that Alec Murdaugh told him he's requested a transfer to prison Florida. Let's cut to that clip real quick.
Yeah, I heard that y'all wanted an update on Alex. Me and him was at Kirkland together, and we talked a little bit. And he claimed he's innocent for his charges, but he's in fear of his life. What other inmates or someone might do to him, or like prison guards. So he put in for an interstate compact where he could get shipped to another state. And as far as I know, I think he got shipped to Florida. And he says in about 2 or 3 years he's gonna come back up, and he said he's gonna beat his charges because he done lost everything, and he claims he's innocent. But I mean, they found him guilty and put him in jail. So I mean, that's up to them. As far as his character, he seemed like an alright dude, you know. If he did do what he did, then he got real bad problems. And I hope he gets the punishment that he deserves. And if we can give you another update later on, we will. But right now, they got him like PC protected custody, and I don't think you can even like track him right now because they're shipping him to other states and stuff.
All right, so will Murdaugh be transferred to Florida? First of all, no evidence that that individual, very poorly concealed, by the way, the dental records I think are going to give that guy away. But anyway, no evidence that that individual actually talked to Alex Murdaugh. But assuming Murdaugh has actually made this request, is there any chance he would be transferred to Florida? Sources familiar with his incarceration status have told us absolutely not. First of all, with over 100 state charges pending, with now nearly 24 federal charges pending, Alex Murdaugh's not going anywhere anytime soon. He's going to have to be appearing multiple times in court. His attorneys are going to have access to him regularly as he addresses all these charges and as his appeal on the murder convictions moves through the process. So they're going to need access to him on the reg for the foreseeable future, and the cost and the security concerns that would go with transferring him from an out-of-state location, just not feasible at this moment. Now, once all of these legal dramas are resolved, there's a very strong chance Murdaugh could be transferred as part of an interstate cooperative agreement within the correctional system. So obviously we'll keep an eye on that. But for the time being, no chance Alex Murdaugh's going anywhere. So as he continues to receive all those love letters, we'll continue to keep you posted on his status. By the way, our research director, Jen Wood, has filed the latest FOIA request for the next round of Alex Murdaugh's prison correspondence. So we hope to have that information for you very soon as we continue to cover this story. But the big news again in the Murdaugh world this week, a huge legal drama unfolding between state and federal prosecutors over who gets to try those financial crimes, who's going to get those first convictions or plea deals related to Alex Murdaugh's many financial crimes. Again, last week, we talked about the attorneys on the civil side going against each other, Eric Bland and Ronnie Richter going up against Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin. This time, those lawyers are out of the fight. This time, it's the prosecutors fighting against each other. So legal drama on every front. Here as the Murdaugh murders, crime, and corruption saga rolls on. To keep up to speed on the latest with all these dramas, keep it tuned to FITSNews. We were the tip of spear on this story, and we've continued to break every big story on the Murdaugh saga as it has evolved and unfolded over the past few months. Keep it here for the latest on all things Murdaugh. All right, Jen Wood, we have been talking about corruption in South Carolina's court systems for a very long time. And obviously the Murdaugh crime and corruption saga has elevated that conversation to a whole new energy level, just attracted international attention to just how corrupt, how dirty South Carolina's court system has been over the years. But we're talking today about a part of that system that doesn't get quite the attention, hasn't attracted quite the headlines, probate court. Before we dive into this incredible story that you've uncovered, tell us first, what is probate court?
Well, probate court is the most exciting part of the legal system, but it is complicated and it's very important. Probate court manages estates of deceased persons, minor settlements, guardianships, conservatorships of minors and those incompetent of managing their own affairs, and involuntary commitments to mental institutions. So it's a big part of our court system, and most of us end up there at some point. I mean, you even get your marriage license in South Carolina at the probate court, so it's important.
And you've talked earlier about how this was involved in the Murdaugh case through the Russell Lafitte trial, how he was a conservator for some of the clients that Alex Murdaugh was fleecing of money, allegedly fleecing. I guess these are all still pending charges.
Right.
So that's part of the probate system, the Hampton County probate.
Right. He became conservator over some of the settlements that Alex helped obtain for his clients. And those went through Hampton County probate court because after they got the settlements, and he was conservator, that's where it ended up.
Well, it sounds like this is a court that touches all sorts of financial dealings with some potentially very lucrative decisions. Walk us through, why are we talking about this issue today, Jen?
So this issue came to light. It's the story's right now. It's based in Darlington and Florence counties, and it's over a very large estate of Carlos Hanna, who died in 2010. His wife Johanna survived him. She's still alive. She has Alzheimer's and lives in a home, and her two sons Bradley and Craig Hanna, who are on the will to inherit the estate and help the mother with her affairs. So it's a huge estate, and it's they had attorney Gary Crawford, who's based in Florence. He's a well-known Florence attorney who deals primarily in probate and estates. He was handling their case, and they had been trying to get their file because Craig believed that there were some asset transfers that were done fraudulently to his brother. So it was a lot of assets transferred to his brother, and he wanted to look over it as he had guardianship over his mother. So they along with many other clients of Gary Crawford, were attempting to receive their files. And in March, I don't remember the exact date, mid-March, on a Sunday afternoon, he went to his office, went out to his car, called 911, and died by suicide. He had a self-inflicted gunshot wound when police arrived.
The attorney, Gary Crawford, did.
Yep. So, I mean, all these people who they were saying, we're going to get your files, just come back next week, were left hanging once again because the attorney had died by suicide.
Now, in the aftermath of his shocking death, Jen, and you've got two incredible reports up on FITSNews.com detailing this whole saga, but in the aftermath of his death, a lot of shady dealings going on within that Darlington County probate court system. In fact, several of them raised in a filing submitted by one of the attorneys for Craig Hanna. But pulling this lens back, sort of bigger picture, what kind of abuses are being alleged in this case that you're now looking at and saying, wait a minute, is this happening beyond just these two counties? What kind of abuses are happening in this case first, though?
So, I mean, there's some pretty heavy allegations made in here, specifically appointing conservators and guardians over, individuals who can't manage their own affairs any longer, who aren't related to the individuals, don't necessarily have their best interest in mind, bypassing those who should be in charge of the estate. So they were trying to sell Johanna, specifically her primary residence, and they did it without, they submitted a motion to sell it, and the motion was approved by Judge Lawson in Darlington County, but it was asked to approve it without notifying the parties.
Without notifying them?
Without notifying them, with all of these people who have an interest in what happens to the assets of Johanna. So the guardian.
So not even notifying her guardian.
Right. Exactly.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that as we dig into it, we're seeing the conservator approving, allegedly approving transfer of assets and them being purchased by the judge himself. You can see it in the Register of Deeds. I mean, there could be an explanation. Maybe he would, I can't think of one right now, but we haven't heard the other side of this case. But yeah, there's some really interesting things when you have individuals who aren't necessarily related to the people in charge of their finances and well-being.
In fact, one of them, and here's a theme that we keep hearing, a powerful lawyer legislator, one of the law partners of former South Carolina House Speaker Jay Lucas. Now, he was clearly appointed by this judge you're talking about, Judge Lawson in Darlington County, clearly appointed as a guardian in this case, and yet he's on the record now denying that he was ever appointed in a sternly worded letter issued to the attorney that's fighting some of these issues in this case. Jen, Let me ask you this: if the court system is this susceptible to these kind of abuses,
Hmm.
I mean, we're talking about, again, this is a $20 million estate, uh, it, and we've got questionable political appointments which are now being denied, even though there's a clear record that they were made. I mean, Jim,
Right.
what's going on here?
I mean, I think a lot of people got caught in a corner by, the attorney, Tucker Player's motion and by our story. And I mean, they immediately, Judge Lawson, who was the judge who was over the case in Darlington, immediately recused himself, signed his own order recusing himself, said that the guardian and conservator resigned and needed to make it clear that the guardian had never really been appointed despite his order, and transferring it back to Florence County or to some other county, if it gets appointed to another county to be transferred to. But here's the thing: in the meantime, Johanna, who has Alzheimer's, has no guardian. So, she is in a home. If something emergent were to happen to her right now, if she had a stroke, they had to call her, call the guardian to, make some plan of care. Who is in charge of her? I mean, it's a loophole. She's just hanging out there with nobody, nobody looking out for her well-being.
So we've got a multi-million-dollar estate. They were attempting
Hmm.
to sell a valuable piece of property. In fact, an order was issued authorizing its sale without any notification to this guardian, a state
Hmm.
lawmaker, lawyer, legislator, who now claims he was never even appointed.
Right.
But when you blew the whistle on it, you're telling me that the judge went back and said,
Rescinded his order
wow,
and transferred everything back.
that's a hand in the cookie jar moment if I've ever heard one.
Yeah, yeah. And when somebody is appointed as a guardian or conservator, it is required by law that they submit a fiduciary letter. So this letter, it appoints them officially in this role, and it is registered in the Register of Deeds, so that if somebody were, to need to find out who the conservator or guardian is of somebody, it can easily be pulled. So what I'm finding is that these fiduciary letters aren't available anywhere. So people are finding these properties that are transferred and signed off by a conservator, and the only way they know is the signature on the transfer of deeds. There's no fiduciary letter in the Register of Deeds appointing them in that role.
It's unbelievable. And one of the documents that you included in your report on this, Jen, it was an attorney literally asking the judge to keep it secret,
Right.
not to notify people about it. It's just unbelievable. I wanted to read something to you, Jen, because your reporting has attracted attention from beyond just South Carolina. Obviously, it was all the discussion within South Carolina's court system, everybody talking about your story. But even beyond the borders of South Carolina, I wanted to read this. This is a group called the Center for Estate Administration Reform. We received a letter from their executive director, a gentleman by the name of Rick Black. And I wanted to read you a little bit of what he said in this letter, Jen. Uh, quote, probate frauds have sadly become entitlement for too many insiders in South Carolina. From Greenville to Richland to Hampton to Marlborough to Charleston counties, the problems seem to be growing unabated. And this is the quote I really wanted to zero in on for you. He said, and I quote, I fear state leadership has granted state bar members the freedom to weaponize these courts to serve all members at the expense of vulnerable South Carolinians. He's basically saying well-connected lawyers are ripping people off with the stamp of approval of the state's court system, isn't he?
Yep. And with stories like this, you publish the first and second story in the series, and people start reaching out and saying, this happened. I couldn't find anyone to help me. I ran out of money hiring lawyers to figure out what was going on, or the lawyers were giving me the runaround. And we've had a number of individuals from varying counties across the state reach out, and we're looking at all that stuff because I do think this is extremely widespread, and I think it's gone unchecked for years.
Well, absolutely. And Jen, I hope as you continue your incredible reporting on this, I'd love to get some thoughts from some, if there are any, ethical lawyers in this state about how do we fix this? How do we set up guardrails so that things like this don't happen in the future? I hope you'll be willing to have some of those convos, Jen.
Oh, absolutely. And I did reach out to Rick Black, and we're going to have a conversation about, some ideas that he has for reform, because I think it's time. It's time to make some changes.
Absolutely. Jen Wood, excellent work on this story this week. And obviously, we are just getting into this story. We're just starting. If you have experienced fraudulent activity, if you've been the victim of one of these secret ex parte, no notification transfers involving an asset of one of your loved ones, please let us know. Please let us know, because again, I suspect, as you do, I think, Jen, that this story is going to go much bigger than Darlington and Florence County. I think this is the sort of story that's going to have tentacles throughout the state.
Yeah.
Jen, amazing work. Thank you so much. And again, first of all, thank you for taking such an incredibly complicated issue and really making it digestible for people, because this stuff is not easy. I mean, this is complicated.
No. Probate law is extremely, extremely complicated. And, every county in South Carolina has one probate judge who is popularly elected. And they aren't required to have a law degree. I mean, some do, but many don't. So, it's a complicated facet of our legal system. And I think if people were to understand it a little better, which I'm helping with, I think they could, protect themselves and know what to look for.
Absolutely. Just a huge, wide open avenue for potential corruption. And it seems as you've uncovered some actual corruption. Jen, thank you for exposing it. And let's see what we can get done on this issue, working together moving forward.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
All right, so ever since the United States Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade and thrust the issue of abortion back onto the states, South Carolina has gone back and forth on this issue, people, back and forth. In 2021, lawmakers in the Republican-controlled General Assembly passed what is known as the Heartbeat Bill, which banned all abortions after 6 weeks. Now, this legislation was overturned by the state Supreme Court back in January of this year, a very controversial 3-2 decision, which overturned that heartbeat law and sent it back to the General Assembly. Well, guess what? Lawmakers have sent the Supreme Court another heartbeat bill, essentially, which bans abortions after 6 weeks. So what's changed? Well, according to lawyers for Planned Parenthood, not much. Let's cut to a clip from a court hearing just yesterday in front of Judge Clifton Newman. Here's what they had to say.
So that's back to my question. Am I being asked to overrule the Supreme Court?
Respectfully, Your Honor, no, you aren't. And I think that's true for several reasons. The first reason is that the narrow issue before the Supreme Court in the Planned Parenthood case was the validity of the 2021 Act. This, again, is a new law. It's entitled to a strong presumption of validity, and it's actually a new law that was intentionally designed to address some of the alleged defects in that prior law. In other words, it is not purely controlling on a new law.
Do you want to weigh in on that?
I would just say, Your Honor, I would agree with him if the new law was a 7-week ban, but it's not. It's the exact same time limit. It's 6 weeks. Thank you.
All right, so what has changed between the bill that was overturned by the Supreme Court and the bill that is now apparently headed back to the Supreme Court, because Judge Clifton Newman did issue a temporary injunction on the enforcement of this new legislation before it's heard by the Supreme Court. So effectively, status quo is still in place until the Supreme Court hears this challenge to the state's newest abortion law. But have things changed? Again, that was you heard the attorneys there. They said that basically nothing's changed, but there were a couple key points from the 2021 bill that have been addressed in the 2023 bill. Because I want to rewind the clock back to that first debate over the heartbeat bill, which was found unconstitutional. The key vote there was Justice John Few. And Justice John Few called out lawmakers basically saying, you have imposed this arbitrary 6-week deadline. There's no science underpinning it. You just basically pulled this number out of your asses, essentially. And also, you're not having any discussion about a woman's right to have sufficient time to make this decision. I wanted to get into this a little bit. It's the notion of informed choice. Informed choice. That's what Few basically said, because lawmakers said in their bill an informed choice, but then they admitted later on, hey, well, we had absolutely nothing we based that on. Our timeline's totally arbitrary. So how can you have an informed choice with an arbitrary timeline? It's a good question. That was Justice Few's question. Well, in the new bill, that informed choice language has been stripped. It's out. Lawmakers are no longer referring to that, so they're hoping that'll get them out of that legal loophole there. But they also did something else, which I think is very interesting. What they did was they established through, again, a scientific process, a delineation, exactly when they believe conception occurs, implantation occurs, and when a woman would need to know through a EPT test when she's pregnant. They define these things in the bill, so no longer would the justice on the court, Justice John Few, be able to say, oh, well, you just arbitrarily did this. Well, no, lawmakers actually said, hey, we have defined specifically when we are saying that this process starts, when the clock starts, which again, obviously that imposes a tremendous obligation on the women of South Carolina as far as getting those pregnancy tests. But they have at the very least now no longer imposed an arbitrary standard. So they removed that language about informed choice and they defined a non-arbitrary standard. Now here's where this gets important. Justice Few is the key vote here. Justice Few is the key vote here because I'm telling you, I talked to State Senator Tom Davis earlier. Tom Davis has been one of the few Republicans who has been very sensible in this issue, not being pulled from one side or the other. Senator Davis is Catholic. He's pro-life. But he has also, throughout this process, been very attuned to trying to do the right thing here as far as particularly the exemptions and some of these specific objections that were raised by Justice Few. And I talked to Tom Davis, and one of the things he told me, and I quote, this is what he said, quote, if the reason the fetal heartbeat bill is upheld 3-2 is because the only female justice was replaced, I don't think that's a good look for South Carolina. He said, I don't think that's a good look for South Carolina. Guess what? Senator Davis is absolutely right. He's absolutely right, because when this issue was decided back in January, Justice Kay Hearn was on the court. She's now no longer on the court. She retired, been replaced by Justice Garrison Hill. Now, Hill is going to be a vote for the legislature on this, a vote to uphold this piece of legislation. So this is going to be upheld. In fact, go ahead. If you're following this issue, if you're pro-life or pro-choice, this is all really semantics, because guess what? The new heartbeat bill, heartbeat 2, whatever you want to call it, the 6-week and after ban, it will be upheld by the South Carolina Supreme Court. But the question, what's that margin going to be? And that's going to be very significant on the campaign trail. It's going to be very significant as some of these Republican lawmakers face challenges from the right in certain districts, from the left in other districts. Because again, this put Republicans on the hot seat once already. That seat is now scorching as this case heads to the Supreme Court. And if it is a 3-2 vote based on the only woman on the court no longer being there, man, that temperature is going to rise even higher, even higher. So we'll be watching very closely to see if these changes that state senators and state representatives put into this bill in an effort to get Justice Few to see it as constitutional, we'll be very interested to see if that works, because if they don't, and if this is a 3-2 vote, in the immortal words of Senator Davis, all hell could break loose. All hell could break loose. But keep on tuned to FITSNews. Listen, we've been covering this issue for years as it's made its way through the General Assembly. Like Senator Davis, I am pro-life, but I also see the point for these exemptions. But wherever you fall on this issue, know that FITSNews, we have an open microphone as we do on every issue. So please, you've got a view on it, divergent from ours, different from ours, contrary to ours, we'd love to share it with our audience, because again, that's what we're here for. That's what the marketplace of ideas is all about. But count on us to continue to focus on this issue. And unlike the mainstream media, who they don't even talk about these key issues, folks. I was looking before we did this segment. None of the media are talking about these changes. We dive into it. We tell you exactly why the bills are different and exactly why that matters and could matter down the road as this thing heads to the Supreme Court. But keep it tuned to FITSNews as it does for the very latest on South Carolina's ongoing abortion debate. All right, folks, that's a wrap for this week's edition of the Week in Review. I want to thank you for tuning in. Obviously, a lot coming up as the 2024 presidential primary heats up. New candidates jumped in the race this week. We covered those announcements extensively on FITSNews.com. But if you want to see how your preferred presidential prospect did, check out our Palmetto Political Stock Index. There it is, that gorgeous graphic. Every time I see it, I get excited. Mark Powell and I compile that every week, giving you an update on how the various contenders are faring. But as we dove into national issues quite a bit this past week, folks, I got into some geopolitical hotspots. Talking about the Strait of Hormuz, people. Who knew? I knew about all that good stuff. And not only that, the NATO drama in the Baltic. I covered that this week. USS Gerald R. Ford. Check those articles out on FITSNews.com. But I wanted to bring you a little bit of a preview about next week's episode. This coming week, Special Projects Director Dylan and I will be headed to the border. Dylan Nolan did a huge piece on the latest developments on the U.S.-Mexican border this past week. Well, guess what? We're going to see it for ourselves this coming week. So be on the lookout in next week's Week in Review for a big package on the issue of border security, how it's impacting not only our country, but the state of South Carolina. We're going to bring you everything that we see there so that you can make an informed decision for yourself. Because once again, as we were talking about earlier on the abortion debate, that's why we're here, people, to host a conversation here in the marketplace of ideas. We're glad you checked into this conversation, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the Week in Review.